the alien princess declared the human her own. The empire quaked. Most alien species dismissed them as curiosities, unfit to command respect and barely worth noticing. Yet here he was, standing in the heart of the Aurelian Empire, the greatest empire the galaxy had ever known, wearing a uniform that barely fit him and trying very hard not to draw attention. The imperial capital was a city of impossible height and impossible beauty. Towers of polished crystal shimmered in the sunlight, connected by bridges that seemed to float in the air. The streets below were alive with alien species of all shapes and sizes. Some had wings, some had tentacles, some seemed almost entirely composed of light. Each moved with a purpose, their minds working in harmony with the Empire's psychic currents. Humans did not possess these gifts. Humans relied on instinct, determination, and stubbornness, and Ethan often wondered if that was enough in a galaxy that worshipped control. He was here to perform a simple task, assist with communication between the princess and visiting delegates from a distant star system. It was a low-ranking position, tedious and invisible, but it kept him alive and fed. Ethan had learned long ago that survival often meant keeping one's head down and letting others do the thinking. The palace, where the princess resided, was even more breathtaking. Towers of iridescent metal spiraled into the sky, and the halls were wide enough to allow dozens of people to walk side by side. The air hummed with psychic energy, a constant, invisible tide that humans could barely feel. The Aurelian nobility moved through it as though it were second nature, their every thought and feeling shared in subtle, unspoken ways. Humans could not do this. Humans had to speak. Humans had to act. Humans had to take risks. Ethan walked through the grand hall, clutching a translator device tightly. Today was a ceremonial gathering, a meeting of the Imperial Council and foreign envoys. Princess Saralith, the only heir to the throne, was to address them, demonstrating the Empire's unity and strength. It was meant to be a display, a careful performance in which every move, every word, every glance was calculated. Humans rarely participated in such events, and when they did, it was only as servants or messengers. Ethan's role was to remain unseen, unnoticed, and unheard. As the ceremony began, Ethan observed from a distance. Princess Saralith was tall, elegant, and radiated authority. Her eyes, a deep shade of violet, seemed to look beyond the room, beyond the council, beyond the universe itself. Her presence was not loud or dramatic. It did not need to be. The very air responded to her. The Aurelian nobles bowed, their minds aligned with hers in a silent, psychic acknowledgement of her command. Humans could not understand this. They could only feel a vague unease in their stomachs. Ethan noticed it before anyone else. A ripple of tension passed through the crowd, almost imperceptible but enough to make him uneasy. Something was wrong. He could not see the threat, but instinct told him to watch. The human mind had no psychic shield, no premonition, no gift of foresight, but it had something else, intuition shaped by countless generations of survival. Then it happened. A shadow moved faster than any eye could follow, darting toward the princess. The nobles froze, their psychic link hesitating, confused. In that moment of hesitation, the assassin struck. Ethan didn't think. He didn't calculate. He ran. He threw himself in front of the princess, taking the brunt of the attack. A blade, sharp and humming with energy, pierced his shoulder. Pain erupted, but he barely registered it. All that mattered was the life he protected. He shoved the attacker aside, throwing him off balance, and the guards finally reacted, subduing the would-be killer. The hall erupted in chaos. Nobles shouted, aides scrambled, and the princess herself froze, shocked beyond comprehension. She had never seen a human act with such courage, such reckless determination. The guards carried Ethan to safety, his body shaking from the pain, his mind buzzing with adrenaline. Saralith watched him as he was tended to. Her violet eyes held something she had never allowed anyone to see: curiosity. respect, awe. She had spent her life surrounded by people who obeyed her out of fear or loyalty, people who moved like shadows within her psychic influence. And now, here was a human who had acted without thinking of reward, without considering consequence, without fear. When he recovered enough to speak, the princess approached him personally. The court expected a formal thank you, a polite acknowledgement that would erase the incident from memory. Instead, Sarilith spoke directly, her voice calm but sharp. "You did not hesitate," she said. "You protected me when others could not. Tell me why." Ethan looked up at her, wincing as he adjusted his shoulder. "I didn't think," he admitted. "I just did what had to be done." The simplicity of his words stunned her. There was no flattery, no fear, no appeal to authority. He spoke as a human, as someone who acted not out of obligation or strategy, but out of instinct. In the following days, Sarilith became obsessed with Ethan. She summoned him repeatedly, asking questions about humanity, about Earth, about the strange, stubborn species that could survive without psychic gifts, without loyalty enforced by mind, without centuries of breeding to command obedience. Ethan answered honestly, unaware of the danger he now faced. Every word he spoke fascinated her because humans did not conform to the rules of the Empire. Humans could not be controlled by thought alone. Humans adapted. Humans survived. Humans endured. Meanwhile, the Empire dismissed the incident as an anomaly, an attack that failed, a human who acted bravely but inconsequentially. They did not understand that something profound had shifted. The princess's fascination with a human was not just curiosity, it was recognition. Recognition of a strength that the Empire had long ignored. Ethan, unaware of the stir he had caused, continued his duties. He interacted with foreign envoys, translated their words, and observed the Empire's complex dance of politics. Everywhere he went, he noticed the subtle differences that humans brought. They could think independently, act unpredictably, and challenge assumptions in ways that no Aurelian had ever imagined. One evening, Sarilith invited him to her private gardens, high above the city. The view was breathtaking. Towers of crystal reflected the setting sun, alien flora glowed softly in the twilight, and the stars above promised infinite possibilities. She walked beside him, her presence commanding, yet strangely human in its curiosity. "Humans are different," she said quietly. "I have never met anyone like you." Ethan shrugged, trying to hide the weight of his shoulder wound. "Maybe that's a good thing," he replied. "Sometimes being different is the only way to survive." She paused, considering his words. "Survival and more than survival. You endure when others would break. You act when others hesitate. You inspire." Ethan felt a strange mixture of pride and discomfort. Humans were not used to being admired in such a direct way, especially not by someone who could command empires with thought alone. The days passed, and Ethan became a fixture in the palace, not by choice, but by the princess's insistence. Nobles whispered behind closed doors, questioning her judgment, mocking her fascination with a human who should be invisible. Yet Sarilith ignored them. She continued to speak with Ethan, learning about the human way of thinking, the human capacity for hope, resilience, and courage. The first part of Ethan's journey was complete not with a battle, nor with victory, but with understanding. He had survived not because of power or psychic ability, but because he had acted when it mattered most, when others were paralyzed by fear or tradition. Unbeknownst to him, the Empire was already beginning to shift. Whispers of the human who protected the princess spread through noble circles. Some laughed, some scoffed, some feared. They did not yet realize that the presence of a human at the heart of imperial power would challenge everything they believed. As night fell over the capital, Ethan sat in the gardens with Sarilith, looking out over the city. The air was cool, carrying the scent of alien blossoms and the faint hum of psychic energy. For the first time in his life, he felt that humans might have a place in this galaxy, not as servants or curiosities, but as equals, as beings capable of shaping destiny. Sarilith looked at him, her violet eyes reflecting the starlight. "Ethan," she said softly, "I think the Empire has underestimated your kind, but perhaps that is about to change." Ethan nodded, unsure of what the future held but certain of one thing. Humans might be small, fragile, and unremarkable by the galaxy's standards, but they had something no empire, no psychic power, and no ancient bloodline could ever take away: courage, resilience, and the will to act when it mattered most. And in that moment, a spark was lit, one that would soon grow into a fire capable of shaking the foundations of the greatest empire in the galaxy. Ethan had survived the first trial, not by strength, not by power, but by being human. And for the first time, he realized that sometimes, being human was enough to change the course of history. Ethan Hale had expected the palace to return to its normal rhythm after the chaos of the assassination attempt, but nothing in the Aurelian Empire was ever normal. Every day brought whispers, glances, and tension that seemed to thicken the very air. For a human who had spent a life learning to stay invisible, this was overwhelming. Yet Ethan had no choice but to adapt, as the princess herself had made it clear. He would no longer be ignored. Princess Sarilith summoned him to her private chambers one morning. The corridors leading to her room were quieter than usual, the hum of psychic energy almost imperceptible, as if the entire palace itself were holding its breath. Ethan walked briskly, his shoulder still healing from the wound he had sustained in the attack. Pain throbbed with each step, but he refused to let it slow him. He had learned that in situations like this, hesitation could be deadly, not from enemies outside, but from the world that suddenly expected him to act. The princess awaited him with calm precision. She was seated on a low platform of polished crystal, her violet eyes fixed on him as he entered. No servants or guards crowded the room. Here, it was just the two of them, a human and a princess, standing at the threshold of a decision that could alter the fate of the galaxy. "Ethan," she said, her voice soft yet commanding, "the Empire sees you as insignificant. I see something else. I see a being who acts when others hesitate, who thinks beyond the rules, beyond the tradition, beyond fear." Ethan swallowed. He had never been praised like this before, especially not by someone who wielded power over billions. I just did what anyone would do," he said. "I didn't think about it. He trailed off, unsure how to explain instincts that came from human experience rather than careful training or psychic ability. Sarilith leaned forward slightly, a faint smile on her lips. "No one else in this empire would have acted without thinking of themselves first. That is why I summoned you. That is why I am about to do something unprecedented." Ethan frowned, unease rising in his chest. "What do you mean?" The princess rose, her movements fluid, graceful, and yet deliberate. "I am declaring you under my personal claim," she said, each word measured, deliberate, and weighty. "From this moment you are bound to me, protected by my authority and accountable only to me." The word struck Ethan like a physical blow. In the Aurelian Empire, personal claims were sacred. They were reserved for champions, powerful allies, or strategic marriages. No human had ever received such recognition. Humans were servants, diplomats, laborers, and curiosities, but never equals, never protected, and never central to imperial politics. "Wait, what does that mean?" Ethan asked, his voice barely hiding his confusion. "Am I in trouble?" Sarilith shook her head. "No. You are in danger if others attempt to harm you because of this, yes, but it is not a punishment, it is a recognition. You have proven yourself in ways the Empire refuses to understand. This is my declaration. You are mine." Ethan stared at her, his mind raced. Every instinct screamed caution. The nobility, the council, the priest castes, they would not accept this. They would see him as an insult, a threat, an anomaly that could unravel their carefully balanced society. But even as his heart pounded, he could not deny a sense of honor and gravity. He had acted as a human without thought of reward, and now, unexpectedly, the highest authority in the Empire had chosen to recognize that. "Why me?" he asked finally. "Why a human?" Saralith's eyes softened, yet their intensity did not waver. "Because you are different. You do not bend to fear. You do not manipulate, and you do not scheme. You act with clarity, instinct, and courage. That is a rarity in this empire, even among those born into it. You remind me of what we have forgotten." For days after the declaration, whispers filled the halls of the palace. Servants gossiped in hushed tones, nobles exchanged sharp glances, and ambassadors murmured among themselves. The empire had never seen anything like this. A human had been bound to the princess, not as a servant, but as someone under her personal protection. The shockwaves spread quickly, for everyone understood the implication. The empire's traditions were being challenged, and its heir was doing so openly. Ethan tried to continue his duties, translating and guiding foreign envoys, but nothing felt the same. Every step he took was watched. Every word he spoke was measured and analyzed. He had become a symbol not by his choice, but by the declaration of a princess. One evening, he found himself in the palace gardens again, standing beside Saralith as the sun dipped below the horizon. The garden stretched endlessly, filled with alien plants that glowed softly, their leaves and petals moving as though alive. The sky turned shades of deep purple and gold, and the stars began to shimmer like distant jewels. "Do you understand what you have done?" Saralith asked quietly. "By accepting my claim, you have changed the course of this empire. Nobles are questioning their loyalty. Advisors are debating your place in the hierarchy, and the council," she paused, her lips curving slightly. "They fear you." Ethan shook his head, trying to ignore the pain in his shoulder. "I didn't do anything. You made the declaration. I just accepted it because I had no choice." "Choice is what makes humans remarkable," she said softly. "You act not because of power, influence, or tradition, but because it is necessary. That is something this empire has not seen in centuries." The days grew tense as Saralith began involving Ethan more in her daily routines. She asked for his opinions on diplomatic matters, military strategies, and even governance. Ethan often hesitated, unsure if his ideas mattered, but Saralith listened intently. She valued his perspective, not because he was a human, but because he thought differently, adaptively, independently, and with a focus on results rather than appearances. The nobles began to grumble openly. A human advising the heir to the throne was not merely unusual, it was intolerable. They whispered that Saralith had been bewitched, manipulated, or blinded by infatuation. Some warned of rebellion. Others plotted in secret, considering how to remove the human from the equation. Despite the tension, Ethan and Saralith grew closer, not romantically but in understanding. She asked questions about Earth, human history, and the struggles that had shaped his species. He spoke of survival against impossible odds, of wars, famines, and disasters, and of the human ability to endure when all else fails. Saralith was fascinated. In her empire, strength was measured by psychic power, control, and lineage. Humans had none of these, and yet they survived, thrived, and endured. The logic was simple yet profound. Humans succeeded not because they were stronger, but because they refused to break. One afternoon, a council meeting erupted into chaos. A high-ranking noble demanded that Saralith revoke her claim over Ethan, claiming it violated every tradition, every law, every expectation. He spoke with anger, frustration, and fear, yet his words were met with silence. Saralith rose from her seat, her presence commanding and absolute. "Ethan Hale is under my claim," she said, her voice carrying across the hall. "No one is to question it. No one is to interfere. This decision is final." Murmurs filled the chamber. Some noble faces turned pale with fear, others with disbelief. a few whispered threats that would never reach her ears. The Empire had never experienced such defiance from its heir, and yet no one dared oppose her directly. Ethan felt the weight of the moment. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, what this meant. He was now a central figure in a galaxy-spanning empire. He was not a servant, not a diplomat, not a curiosity. He was a human, and the princess had placed her trust, her authority, and her protection in him. Over the following weeks, the empire began to shift in subtle ways. Advisors who had once dismissed humans began to observe him more closely, searching for weakness, yet finding none. His ideas, his instincts, and his courage became a quiet source of tension and admiration. Humans, long ignored, were suddenly impossible to ignore. Ethan also began to see the cracks within the empire. He observed nobles plotting, advisors scheming, and alliances forming in secret. The very rigidity that had sustained the empire for centuries now became a vulnerability. Sarilith noticed it too, and together they began to consider possibilities no Aurelian had dared to imagine. One evening, as the twin moons of the capital rose, Ethan and Sarilith walked through the gardens again. The air was cool, filled with the scent of alien blossoms, and the glow of bioluminescent plants reflected softly on their faces. "You are changing the empire without trying," Sarilith said softly. "It terrifies them, yet they cannot stop it. You are human, and yet you have more power than any psychic or noble here. You have shown them that their rules do not define strength." Ethan looked out at the gardens, at the stars above, and then back at her. "I'm not trying to change anything. I just survive. I act when it matters. That's all humans do." "And yet that is enough," she said. "That is enough to make an empire quake." In that moment, Ethan realized the truth. Humans were underestimated, ignored, and dismissed, yet they possessed something the greatest empire in the galaxy had never accounted for: the ability to endure, to act, and to survive against all odds. The Aurelian Empire had assumed humans were weak. They were wrong, and Princess Sarilith had just proven it to the galaxy. The galaxy had always assumed that the Aurelian Empire was untouchable. Its fleets of psychic-controlled warships, disciplined armies, and centuries of tradition gave it a sense of invincibility. Yet, as Princess Sarilith walked through her council chambers, flanked by Ethan Hale, she felt the first stirrings of doubt from the universe itself. A warning message had arrived from a neighboring star system, the Valix Confederation. They had been watching the Empire carefully, noting its internal tensions and sensing opportunity. The message was simple: your empire is weakened by internal chaos. Submit to our terms or face war. Sarilith read the message aloud, her violet eyes scanning the council. The nobles murmured, some with fear, others with arrogance. They had grown accustomed to projecting strength, to controlling both their people and the galaxy. A threat was new, a challenge unfamiliar. Ethan, standing quietly beside the princess, felt the tension in the room as acutely as anyone. Humans were not psychic. They could not sense the subtle manipulations of power that pulsed through the room. But humans had other senses: intuition, observation, and a stubborn resolve that often surprised other species. He studied the council, noting who seemed genuinely concerned, who sought to manipulate, and who would hesitate in battle. "Your Highness," he said finally, "the enemy is testing us. They expect the empire to fracture, but there is a way to respond that they cannot predict." A ripple of skepticism passed through the council. Humans had no experience with psychic command, no access to centuries of military doctrine, no understanding of the empire's hierarchical control. And yet, Sarilith's attention sharpened. She had learned that Ethan's perspective was valuable because it was unlike anything her advisors could provide. "What do you suggest?" she asked. Ethan paused, weighing his words carefully. "The empire relies on psychic coordination. It's its strength and its weakness. If they disrupt that link, the fleet will falter. But humans do not rely on psychic unity. We act independently, adapt quickly, and make decisions in chaos. Let us use human tactics, decentralized command, autonomous units, flexible strategy. We fight like humans, not like Aurelians. The nobles gasped. Such a strategy would be seen as reckless, even heretical. To abandon the psychic network was unthinkable, yet Sarilith nodded slowly. "Prepare your teams," she said. "We will use this method. Let them see that the strength of humans is not to be ignored." In the weeks that followed, Ethan trained with selected units. He worked alongside humans and sympathetic aliens, teaching them to act independently, make quick decisions, and trust their instincts. The fleet practiced maneuvers that broke centuries of tradition, testing new formations and unpredictable tactics. Many officers resisted, arguing that such methods were chaotic and dangerous. Ethan reminded them that humans had survived and thrived precisely because they embraced uncertainty and adapted to it. When the Valix forces finally arrived, their attack was precise and brutal. They deployed psychic disrupting technology, a weapon designed to sever the connection that allowed Aurelian fleets to act as a single, unified force. Ships faltered, battleships drifted into each other, and confusion spread through the ranks. Yet the units that Ethan had trained moved differently. They acted independently, responded to threats without waiting for psychic signals, and adapted to each situation with rapid ingenuity. Human-led teams repaired breaches, coordinated ambushes, and turned disadvantages into advantages. In the chaos, humans became the backbone of the defense. Sarilith watched from her command chamber, her mind focused, her violet eyes scanning every movement. She had always known humans were resilient, but seeing them in action was different from hearing stories. Their courage was not born of power, but of determination and resourcefulness. The very qualities the Empire had dismissed for centuries became its salvation. The battle raged across the stars, light and energy flaring in every direction. Ships exploded, leaving trails of fire and debris. Alien soldiers fought bravely, but their movements were rigid, reliant on psychic coordination. Humans acted freely, exploiting gaps and weaknesses. One by one, key points in the Valix formations collapsed, and the enemy began to retreat. Victory came not through psychic dominance or overwhelming firepower, but through unpredictability, adaptability, and courage, the hallmarks of humanity. When the smoke cleared, the Empire stood, battered but unbroken. And at the heart of it, Ethan Hale and his human-led units were hailed as heroes. The victory sent ripples through the Aurelian Empire. Nobles who had doubted the human presence now viewed them with a mixture of fear and respect. Advisors who had mocked Ethan's ideas were forced to reconsider their assumptions. And Sarilith, standing beside him as the Empire celebrated its survival, realized the profound truth. Humans were not just survivors, they were catalysts for change. Yet, victory brought new challenges. News of the human-led defense spread across the galaxy. Other star systems, both allies and rivals, began to take notice. The concept of a human influencing imperial strategy was unprecedented. Whispers of rebellion and admiration traveled in equal measure. Some feared the influence of humans, claiming it could destabilize centuries of order. Others saw an opportunity to challenge the Empire, assuming humans were expendable or vulnerable. Ethan, aware of his growing prominence, remained cautious. The Aurelian Empire had protected him through Sarilith's claim, but he understood that influence brought danger as well as opportunity. Every decision, every action was scrutinized. One misstep could unravel everything. Yet he found confidence in the same truth that had guided him throughout his life. Humans endure, act, and adapt when others falter. As weeks turned into months, Ethan and Sarilith worked together to reform key strategies. They improved fleet coordination by combining psychic units with autonomous human-led squads. They trained officers to think independently, to respond to crises without rigid protocols, and to trust intuition as well as tradition. Slowly, the empire began to evolve. The Valix threat had been a test, one the empire survived thanks to humans, but threats were not limited to the battlefield. Political intrigue simmered beneath the surface. Nobles continued to question Seralith's decisions, some plotting in secret to remove Ethan from the equation. Spies, assassins, and agitators moved quietly, waiting for a moment of weakness. Seralith was unshaken. She had placed her trust in a human, and that trust had been proven. Yet she understood the stakes. To maintain order, she would need to balance tradition with innovation, loyalty with risk, and power with adaptability. And she knew that the greatest strength the Empire now possessed was one it had never fully recognized before: human resilience. One night, as the twin moons rose over the capital, Ethan and Seralith stood on a balcony overlooking the city. Fires of celebration burned in the streets, signaling victory and survival. Yet both knew that the galaxy was watching and new challenges would come. "You changed the outcome of the war," Seralith said softly, her violet eyes reflecting the moonlight. "Without you, we would have been crushed." Ethan shook his head. "I didn't do it alone. Humans helped, yes, but it was everyone willing to adapt, to fight differently, to survive. That's what humans do. We endure, we act when others hesitate. And we survive when everyone thinks we cannot." Seralith smiled, a mixture of pride and resolve. "And that is why the Empire will never underestimate humans again. Not while you are here, Ethan. You have shown the galaxy that strength is not just power or psychic ability. It is courage, adaptability, and the will to endure." Ethan looked out over the city, feeling the weight of what had happened and the possibilities ahead. For the first time, humans were no longer spectators in a galaxy ruled by ancient bloodlines and psychic power. They were participants, catalysts, and now undeniable forces. The Empire had quaked at the notion of a human bound to the princess. It had been tested by war and survived because of that human. And now the stage was set for a new era, one where humans could shape the future, not because they sought power, but because they had proven themselves indispensable. In the weeks that followed, the Empire adapted. Fleet training changed, council meetings incorporated new perspectives, and the very concept of strategy evolved. Humans were no longer just tools. They were partners, innovators, and sometimes heroes. Ethan's presence inspired change across the ranks. Nobles who had resisted began to accept that humans could think, lead, and even save the Empire when needed. Yet, not all challenges had been faced. Rival empires watched, jealous and wary. Internal conspiracies simmered, waiting for weakness to exploit. But Ethan had learned the core truth of humanity. Even in the face of overwhelming danger, humans endure. They act when others hesitate, adapt when plans fail, and survive when all else seems lost. And as he stood beside Seralith, gazing at the stars, he understood that this was only the beginning. The Empire had survived the first true test of human influence, but the galaxy would not wait. The next challenge would be larger, more dangerous, and more decisive. Humans were ready, and the Empire, once unshakable, was about to be remade. The victory against the Valix Confederation had brought relief to the Aurelian Empire, but it had also shaken the foundations of power. For centuries, the Empire had been ruled by tradition, psychic control, and lineage. Yet now, a human stood at the side of the heir to the throne, recognized publicly and credited with saving the Empire. Some saw this as a triumph, others saw it as a threat. Whispers of rebellion began to stir. High-ranking nobles, whose influence had been diminished by Princess Seralith's bold actions, conspired in secret. They claimed she had abandoned tradition, that she had been seduced by a human's courage, and that her choices endangered the Empire's stability. Hidden alliances formed in shadowed halls, and spies gathered intelligence on Ethan Hale, the human who had become the symbol of change. Ethan was aware of the danger, though he did not fully understand the scope. He had survived physical attacks, political manipulation, and interstellar war, but the human mind could not ignore the subtleties of treachery. In quiet moments, he observed the council's members, noting the tension in their eyes, the cautious words, and the veiled threats. Every smile carried suspicion, every gesture carried a warning. Yet he remained calm, drawing on the same instincts that had kept him alive in countless moments of uncertainty. Humans survived by observing, adapting, and acting when it mattered most. Princess Sarilith, however, faced the challenge directly. She did not shy away from confrontation. Her violet eyes burned with resolve as she gathered her council. "The Empire will not fracture because of fear," she said. "Ethan Hale is under my claim, protected by my authority. Any who oppose him oppose me, and any who oppose me oppose the Empire itself." The nobles bristled. Some whispered about the ancient laws she was violating. Others spoke openly of revolt. The emperor's advisors, bound by centuries of rigid doctrine, found themselves powerless against the combination of Sarilith's authority and the undeniable proof of human-led success in battle. In the weeks that followed, small incidents began to escalate. Assassins attempted attacks on human advisors. Sabotage disrupted supply lines. Propaganda spread rumors that the princess had been bewitched by the human, that the Empire's strength had been compromised. Yet each attempt failed. Humans, trained to act independently and adapt quickly, were always one step ahead. Ethan, despite his growing prominence, refused to flee or hide. He understood the gravity of his presence. To run would be to admit weakness. To hide would be to concede defeat. Instead, he stood beside Sarilith, visible, unyielding, and calm. His courage inspired the humans under his guidance and unsettled those who sought to oppose him. One evening, as the twin moons rose over the capital, Sarilith received word of an organized coup attempt. A faction of nobles had conspired with psychic mercenaries to seize control of the palace during a council meeting. The news came quietly, through trusted channels, but the stakes were clear. The Empire could fracture if the attempt succeeded, and the consequences would be catastrophic. Ethan and Sarilith moved swiftly. They gathered loyal forces, human-led squads, and sympathetic nobles. The palace, usually a place of ceremony and order, became a battlefield of strategy, deception, and courage. Hallways were patrolled, communications were monitored, and positions were fortified. Every detail mattered, for the coup would not wait for mistakes. When the conspirators struck, they expected chaos. They expected panic. They expected the humans to falter. What they found instead was coordination, adaptability, and courage, the very qualities that had saved the Empire in battle. Human-led squads moved independently, cutting off entry points, protecting key chambers, and neutralizing threats with precision. Ethan himself acted without hesitation, directing forces, neutralizing danger, and inspiring those around him. The coup failed, but not without cost. Battles raged through the palace, leaving scars on walls and corridors, and demonstrating that the Empire's strength was no longer guaranteed by tradition alone. In the aftermath, the conspirators were captured, exiled, or imprisoned. Yet the message was clear. The era of blind obedience was over. Humans, once considered weak, had proven they could shape the outcome of history. Sarilith, standing in the command chamber, surveyed the aftermath. Her violet eyes rested on Ethan. "You did not falter," she said softly. "Even when the Empire itself seemed to turn against us, you stood firm." Ethan shook his head. "I did what had to be done. Humans survive by acting when others hesitate. That is all. It is nothing remarkable." "It is remarkable," Sarilith insisted. "The Empire has always relied on power, lineage, and psychic control. but you have shown that courage, adaptability, and determination can be stronger than any law, any fleet, any tradition. You are human, and yet you have changed everything. In the weeks following the failed coup, Saralith issued reforms that would forever alter the empire. Humans were granted recognition, advisory roles, and positions of influence. The rigid hierarchy that had governed the empire for centuries began to adapt, incorporating flexibility, independent thinking, and adaptability, the very traits that humans had demonstrated. Ethan continued his work, helping to train officers, advise on strategy, and guide new policies. His presence, once considered insignificant, became central to the empire's evolution. Humans were no longer mere subjects or curiosities. They were participants in governance, strategy, and defense. Their ability to act under pressure, to endure chaos, and to adapt to challenges was now recognized as invaluable. The galaxy, observing these changes, began to take notice. Other empires reconsidered their assumptions about humans. Alliances shifted, trade agreements were renegotiated, and the balance of power began to move subtly but irreversibly. Humans, long underestimated, were now impossible to ignore. Yet even in this moment of triumph, Ethan remained cautious. He understood that power and influence were double-edged swords. The empire had survived battles and rebellion, but the challenges of governance, diplomacy, and external threats were ongoing. Humans had proven their worth, but survival required constant vigilance, adaptability, and courage. Saralith, however, felt a sense of hope she had never known. With Ethan at her side, she saw possibilities that transcended tradition, power, and fear. The empire could be stronger, more just, and more resilient. Humans, once dismissed, had become a symbol of potential, a reminder that true strength often lay in unexpected places. In the months that followed, the empire began to stabilize. Humans took on more prominent roles. Advisors integrated human perspectives into strategy, and the balance of power shifted. The nobles who had opposed the human presence were either reconciled, reformed, or removed. The empire, once rigid and unyielding, became more adaptable, resilient, and capable of facing the challenges of a galaxy in constant flux. Ethan and Saralith spent countless hours discussing strategy, diplomacy, and philosophy. They spoke of the lessons humans had learned from survival, of the mistakes and triumphs that had shaped their species, and of how those lessons could guide the empire into a new era. Each conversation strengthened their bond, rooted not in power or obligation, but in mutual respect, understanding, and shared purpose. One evening, as they stood on a balcony overlooking the capital, the city bathed in the glow of twin moons, Saralith spoke quietly. "Ethan, the empire has changed because of you. Humans are no longer beneath us. You have shown them, and me, what it means to endure, to act, and to survive. The galaxy will never forget this." Ethan looked out over the city, feeling the weight of history and the promise of the future. "I didn't do it alone. Humans survive because we adapt, we act when it matters, and we endure when others fail. That is all I have done." Saralith placed a hand on his shoulder. "And that is enough to remake an empire." The Aurelian Empire, once unchallenged and unyielding, had faced trials of war, rebellion, and internal strife. It had survived because of courage, adaptability, and the unexpected influence of a human who acted when others hesitated. History had been rewritten, not by power alone, but by the strength of spirit, resilience, and the will to endure. Ethan Hale had become more than a human in the eyes of the empire. He had become a symbol, proof that even the smallest, most underestimated species could change the course of history. The galaxy, once certain that humans were weak and insignificant, now watched them with awe, caution, and respect. And at the center of it all, standing beside Princess Saralith, Ethan understood a simple truth. Survival, courage, and the will to act were more powerful than any fleet, any psychic power, or any empire. The empire had quaked at the presence of a human. It had faced threats from without and within, and it had endured. And now it trembled with possibility, ready to embrace a future shaped not by fear or tradition, but by resilience, courage, and the unexpected power of being human. Ethan looked at Seralith, and then at the stars beyond the city. The galaxy was vast, dangerous, and unpredictable, but humans, he realized, were capable of facing it all, not because they were the strongest or the most powerful, but because they refused to break. They acted when others faltered. They adapted when others failed. They endured when all hope seemed lost. And in that enduring, unyielding spirit, the Empire found its future. Humans had survived the impossible, changed the course of history, and shown the galaxy that strength was not measured in power, lineage, or psychic ability, but in courage, adaptability, and the will to endure. The Empire would never be the same, and neither would the humans. The alien princess declared the human her own. The Empire quaked.